Okay, so today being Thursday is more or less Climate Day, the third of our three thematic topics. And so the structure of today is much like it has been for the past couple of days. We'll start the morning with a scientific perspective on the issue at hand, and then the afternoon keynote talk will emphasize the humanist side of the issue at hand. So with that, I'd like to introduce our climate scientist, who's Dr. Peter Raymond. Pete got his PhD at the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and then did a brief postdoc at Woods Hole. Since that time, he's been at Yale University School of Forestry. That's for the past 6 years. And his research group really focuses on the biogeochemistry of natural systems, specifically looking at carbon and nitrogen cycling and exchanges of those materials between aquatic systems and the atmosphere. And his recent work also incorporates how climate and land use change affect the cycling, particularly of organic carbon between these two big reservoirs on Earth. So with that.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for the invitation. So we're going to talk mostly today about the natural carbon cycle. My feeling is where this general field is going is that it's being accepted now that climate change is occurring for the most part, and it's also being accepted that it's driven in part due to the increase in atmospheric CO2. So I didn't want to spend much time talking on that. I wanted to spend more time talking about what we do now, sort of accepting the fact that increased CO2 concentrations are going to change climate, and beginning to accept the fact that the world is starting to mobilize and trying to think about offsetting this increase in atmospheric CO2. Where are we heading, and what are some of the issues, and specifically what are some of the issues when it relates to the natural carbon cycle? And so the first part of this talk, we're going to discuss what the natural carbon cycle is, and then move on to some of the ways where we're thinking about managing the natural carbon cycle as one of the ways to offset increased atmospheric CO2. And feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm sort of used to that. And so this is really driven by increases in CO2 in the atmosphere. And one of the problems is that this pool of atmospheric CO2 is highly dynamic. And this has been one of the reasons why it's taken so long for the scientists to really push and convince the policymakers that increased atmospheric CO2 is from anthropogenic sources. Just a couple of examples to start driving home how dynamic the pool is. It mixes very quickly, right? Most of the CO2 is added into the northern hemisphere, and it'll mix into the southern hemisphere within a year. So there's no, there's point sources of this stuff, but once it gets in the atmosphere, it's everybody's problem, right? Each molecule of CO2 into the atmosphere, it turns over every 4 years. And what this means is that it moves out of the atmosphere into another major pool on Earth, and the two major pools being land and the ocean. So it moves out of the atmosphere into land and the ocean, then comes back every 4 or 5 years or so. So every molecule in the atmosphere only sits there for about 4 or 5 years, and then it's gone. And then one of the things I'm interested in, and a lot of folks are interested in, is the concentrations in the atmosphere are highly linked to biology on land and biology and physics in the ocean. And in particular, biology is something that is not at steady state. It's not static. It's very complicated. Things that drive biology on the Earth scale are hard to understand. And this is one of the reasons why when we start thinking about managing the natural carbon cycle, it becomes difficult, because it's very hard to understand biology at large scales. You know, how is the Arctic tundra going to respond to global warming? This is a very complicated question. But really, you can sort of boil down the global carbon budget to just a couple set of very simple equations that at least these two everyone has already seen at some point in their education, right? So the first one being photosynthesis. Let's see, where was the laser on this? Here it is. So the first one being photosynthesis, right? Where plants, they synthesize these inorganic constituents, right? They take CO2 from the atmosphere and they produce simple sugars. This is what we call organic matter, right? This is the simplest way to write organic matter. It's a carbohydrate. And they also produce oxygen, which we breathe, right? And then the flip side of this equation is it's just in reverse. And this is respiration, right? This is what we do. We eat the organic matter and decompose it back into its inorganic constituents, basically exhaling the CO2 back into the atmosphere. And so one of the big things about the natural carbon cycle is the balance between these two on the global scale, right? How much CO2 is being pulled out of the atmosphere, converted to organic matter where it has a chance to be removed from the atmosphere and not be a greenhouse gas, and how much of it is being burned back to CO2 through respiration and through actually things like forest fires. And so, you know, the way this occurs is you have this pool of atmospheric CO2, right? It's all simple stuff. It gets taken up by the plant in primary production. And you get this simple sugar produced, you know. But plants need a lot of other things other than simple sugars. So they actually utilize a large amount of this simple sugar that they've produced for their own needs, to do things like keep their stomates open, synthesize other compounds that they need for their structure. And so when they do this, right, they respire it right back into the atmosphere. And this balance between primary production and respiration is a big focus of terrestrial scientists. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Right, and so what really starts to become a focus is this pool that's remaining, that isn't being added back to the atmosphere, right? Because this is something that we can then begin to work with respect to managing the natural carbon cycle, right? If we can try to get this pool to be larger and larger, this is a way that we can try to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And the clearest ways that this organic matter works for us, one is to grow more plants, right? If we increase biomass on either above ground where we can see the trees or in soils, we've taken CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? Put them into other storage pools like soils, or perhaps even moving it into the ocean with rivers, which is one of the things I study. But the key here and the simple point with this schematic is just how plants, right, are related to atmospheric CO2. And this same process of primary production is occurring in the ocean, and we'll talk about it on a global scale. So a lot of this, huge amounts of this are occurring on land in the ocean, and part of the idea with managing the natural carbon cycle in the future is to try to, you know, increase this term here. Increase the storage by either growing more plants or placing organic carbon into soils. Right, and one of the clear, you know, one of the there were two things that were important about this curve. This is atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and the obvious first one is that concentrations are increasing. It's impossible to argue with this curve that they're not. Right, for a while there was a pretty big debate whether this was a natural increase in CO2 or whether it was due to anthropogenic burning of fossil fuels. The other thing that was an eye-opener were these wiggles, right? And these wiggles are actually the annual balance between primary production and respiration on land. So at these low points, right, these are in the summer. And in the summertime, right, this equation is dominating. Summertime is when you have all the primary production, and you can actually see these plants pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And you can actually see them move atmospheric concentrations of CO2. And then in the wintertime, when primary production turns off, right, respiration dominates, and you can see atmospheric CO2 concentrations increase. So it was some of the very first evidence of how much of an influence plants can have on atmospheric CO2. And you can actually use the size of these wiggles to try to start to estimate, was it a good year for primary production or a bad year, et cetera.
I'm talking like the opposite seasons of the north and the south there.
Well, most of the plants are in the northern hemisphere, actually. The land masses are dominate in the northern hemisphere, and these signals are partly able to express themselves because the mixing is a little slower. But if you're at the equator, you don't see this, or you see a much smaller because there are no seasons. And then, if you go back in sort of geological time, you can start to see larger wiggles in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And some of these are sometimes due to changes in primary production on land. You can see instances of changes in the plants at the tropics actually express themselves as changes in global atmospheric CO2. So we know that plants on land and in the ocean, right, they can exert pressure on atmospheric CO2 on a year-to-year basis that we can actually measure, and then the geologists will go back and they'll look for correlations between sometimes these big drops in geological time scales and things like glaciation, which can wipe out land plants, and then they'll regrow and suck down CO2.
Excuse me. Is this scale in years?
Pardon me?
Is this scale in years?
Yeah, thousands of years.
Oh,
thousands of years. So this is, 500,000 years ago. And then another point, or just sort of a reminder, everyone, that in the ocean, right, we don't have trees. What we have is these single-cell organisms that carry out all the primary production. And when you really sort of dive into the science about this creates a lot of very interesting differences between how land plants versus ocean plants, what controls their primary production, and how they might sequester CO2. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But in the ocean, right, primary production is dominated by these really interesting singular cell organisms that have very little biomass but can still have high rates of primary production. And then there's one other equation, and I perhaps could have skipped this, but this is what I study, so I really just couldn't force myself to pull it out. But it's chemical weathering, and this is also driven by plants. And what this is basically a way of dissolving minerals, pulling CO2 and dumping it in the ocean. And I'll sort of walk through this, right? So plants, right, they're taking up this atmospheric CO2. We already looked at this, and their roots are pumping the CO2 into soil water, right? So concentrations of CO2 in the water and soils can be really high, much higher than they are in the atmosphere, tens to hundreds of times higher. And when CO2 is in water, it's actually a weak acid. So it will dissolve your major minerals, right? When you have carbonates and silicates, and the CO2 will dissolve these minerals, and the CO2 will get transferred to bicarbonate, right? The critical point is this is not a gas. This doesn't re-exchange with the atmosphere. So as a way to sequester CO2, this is actually a really safe place, because the fate of this stuff is as it gets dumped into the ocean, where it's a very safe place and won't be added back to the atmosphere for millions of years. And then the reverse equation occurs in the ocean also. That is when these phytoplankton, some of these have shells that are made of minerals, right? They're carbonate, like a clam shell, basically. And when they build their shells, they reverse this equation, and the CO2 gets re-released. And so again, when you're trying to study the balance of this over over shorter timescales, it becomes very complicated because you really should be thinking about the whole picture, right? And there are feedbacks here over geological timescales when a lot of this occurs, dumping a lot of calcium and bicarbonate in the ocean, it pushes this equation faster, and it can feed back and put that CO2 right back in the atmosphere. And one of the interesting points is that this process of chemical weathering, right, these plants scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere and dumping it in the ocean, is thought to have been one of the drivers that has gotten atmospheric CO2 concentrations down to what they are today. So what this graph shows is concentrations of CO2, and if you're at 10, you're 10 times current atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And for a long time, for millions of years in the Earth's history, concentrations were very high. They got sucked down at a relatively short period of time on geological timescales. And this is thought to be when land plants first colonized the land. So the land plants went up there, they started pumping this CO2 into soil water, and they drew down CO2 over a long period of time down to concentrations that we recognize today. So on longer time scales, this is thought to be an important process for atmospheric CO2. And so those are basically all the equations, and the question becomes, okay, so how does this scale up to the global scale, right? How big are these processes on a global scale, and how much carbon is moving around? Are they important to the amount of CO2 that is currently in the atmosphere? Can we think about ways where we could tinker with the amount of marine primary production or land primary production, or the amount of biomass on land that will help us be able to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere maybe over the next 50 to 100 years while we start to try to get the engineering going to move to other forms of energy that will decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is basically the simplest way to look at the global carbon budget. And what it is it's just a conceptual diagram of what we think the global carbon budget was before we started burning fossil fuels. Right? And the way this graph works is there's two things on this graph. There are boxes, and inside the boxes there's a number, and that's how big the pool size is. This is how much fossil fuels there are to burn. Right? 3,700 petagrams. And a petagram is 10 to the 50th grams. And so it's also a billion tons. So there are 3,700 billion tons of fossil fuels available to burn. And actually one of the points of the talks is to try to get a handle on what this number actually means. What is 3,700 billion tons? When we start to try to manage the carbon cycle, you know, if we want to pull out 5 billion tons, what is that? I mean, is this easy? Because one of my feelings is, okay, you know, the public is starting to come around to this idea of climate change and we have to do something, but the public has no idea the scale of this problem, how big a billion tons is, and how much work it is, and how much money it's going to be to try to decrease the input of CO2 by 5 billion tons. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. So there's 600 billion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, or there was, before we started dumping it in there. And so what happens on a year-to-year basis is 60 billion tons move into land plants, right? Through this net primary production, right? That's just primary production. However, the vast majority of that was respired right back to the atmosphere through respiration. And this is respiration through plants, bacteria, fungus, animals, right? And so it's actually it was a very tight cycle on land where you weren't really storing much carbon at all, right? They were taking up huge amounts, but they were putting it right back into the atmosphere. And the remainder, this 0.4 units, is modeled to actually just move with rivers into the ocean. So you have this excess organic matter that's being produced, but it's being laterally transported into the ocean. And then you also have this process of chemical weathering, which I discussed, right? It's a pretty small flux, like I said, but it makes the global ledger. We won't talk about that much more. And so rivers are dumping in, almost 1 billion tons of carbon to the ocean. With respect to primary production in the ocean, you have a pretty similar story where you have 50 billion tons are taken up by these single-cell organisms every year. The main difference is that 80% of that is respired right back to CO2 in the atmosphere, right? But there's a chance in the ocean that this stuff can sink out of the surface ocean and move into the deep ocean. And this is a form of sequestration, because once you move it into the deep ocean, you don't see it again for 500 years or so until it upwells with deep water, comes back and resees the atmosphere and vents. So if you can increase this flux into the deep ocean, you've moved CO2 out of the atmosphere for 500 to 1,000 years, which seems like a long time. However, once it goes down there, most of that is respired back to CO2 in the deep ocean and does upwell and revisit the atmosphere, leaving just this small number for burial and long-term removal. Right? This is what has built up all our fossil fuels over the millions of years, just this small storing away of organic carbon. And so it brings up this interesting situation where pre-anthropogenic, right, we have CO2 actually moving out of the ocean into the atmosphere. Oceans were a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. And they're a source because they're subsidized by this input from land, right? So land dumps organic matter into the ocean, bacteria, things in the ocean, use it for a food source, respire it back to CO2 where it goes back into the atmosphere. Right, so this is just a closed budget. And CO2 is sort of on long terms, it's just sort of moving in a circular nature up and around. Any questions on this? Everybody gets it? Global carbon budget? That's it, you're all experts, right? It's pretty simple, pre-anthropogenic, right? This is conceptual. We don't know. This is just, we model this based on what we know what current rates are. It gets a little more complicated when you start to look at the anthropogenic disturbances, right? And so we've put all the anthropogenic disturbances here in red. And so we've created a new cycle, basically. This budget still closes, right? And the main perturbation, right, is we're burning 5 billion tons of CO2 that were being locked away over long periods of time from this flux here and putting it back into the atmosphere. And so the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is growing. And as this concentration is increased, we've changed the concentration gradient between the ocean and the air. Now there's more CO2, a higher concentration in the air than the ocean, and it's moving into the oceans. So it's moving into the oceans mostly simply just due to diffusion. It's just diffusing in there. And the ocean, which I didn't point out, right, has these huge pools of carbon, inorganic carbon. And it can accept all the CO2 we put in the ocean, in the air. And it's going to. And it's going to pull down these CO2 concentrations, but over long time scales, right? If we were to stop burning CO2 in the atmosphere right now, the ocean and atmosphere would equilibrate in 1,000 years. And all that CO2 we'd put in the atmosphere would go into the ocean. So the natural carbon cycle is going to pull us out of any problem. It's just a matter of time scale, right? Can't wait 1,000 years. So we're pumping these 5 units in, and we've increased CO2 in the atmosphere by, 30%, right? There's 160 extra billion tons of there as of 1980s. But there's a couple other interesting things occurring. One is that this ocean is uptaking CO2, right? So it's taking up 2 units a year, right? We're adding 5 from fossil fuels, and the oceans are taking up 2. That's not bad, right? If we didn't have the oceans there, we'd be in much worse trouble than we are now. Similarly, there's a land sink taking up 2 units, and this is due to the processes I was just talking about, right? Some areas forests are growing, and they're accreting biomass. Unfortunately, we're also deforesting large amounts of forest on the planet, and this is adding a lot of CO2 to the atmosphere. But without these natural sinks, we'd be in much worse, we'd have much higher CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere than we currently do. So they're definitely a good thing, and they're working for us, and they will continue to work for us, particularly the oceans. Right? This sink is never going to shut down, basically. The question is, and you can see that the oceans have taken up about 120 billion tons of carbon as of the 80s, which would be sitting up in the atmosphere. So the question becomes, when we start to think about pulling this extra CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? Should we and can we think about changing these fluxes, particularly this one here, and the difference between these two here, right? Because that's really what we're talking about.
Just a quick question. So the land sink flux is bigger, so the positive to the vegetation is bigger?
Both of those fluxes have such big error bars that it's impossible to say for sure, but yeah.
Right, but because the other numbers, so the numbers of the change in the amount of carbon in the vegetation,
Right.
it has decreased.
Right. So most of the deforestation occurred before the 80s, right? And so these forests are regrowing, but at a much slower rate. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So that's the 1980s carbon budget, right? And one of the important points to keep on your radar screen is that, okay, we were just talking about 5.6, I think, gigatons being emitted from fossil fuels, right? This number is going up, right? It hasn't stopped. Even though we've known about this problem, we haven't gotten our hands around it. And so these circles are actual rates of emission over time, annual emissions, right? And they're going up, and they're still going up, and they'll be going up next year, right? We haven't even touched upon this problem of trying to decrease emissions. And actually, one of the scarier points is each one of these is a scenario from the last IPCC report, right? So these are our global modelers trying to model what the emissions are going to be in the future. And we are outpacing the worst case scenario. So our models are outpacing, are conservative, overly conservative. So the emissions in 2005 were higher than worst case scenario from the IPCC report.
Are these just CO2 or other kinds?
This is just CO2, right? And the thought is that our economic models of India and China were no good. Regardless, right now we're up about 8 gigatons, 8 billion tons of CO2 that we're adding to the atmosphere per year, and it's going to be higher next year than it is this year. And one of the interesting points, this is a digression, but when you start talking about stabilizing CO2 emissions, your benchmark number becomes very critical, and policymakers are they're arguing over this. Some people say we should be at 50% of 1990 emissions. So then you're at 3 gigatons, 3 billion tons. Some people say we should be at 50% of current emissions, right? And so you're talking about billions of tons of differences in your benchmark, and it'll be real interesting to see how this plays out and what the actual benchmark will be, because it makes a big difference on how much we have to.
The prior chart where you showed primary production both in oceans and I've heard people talk about saturation points of the cycle to continue to absorb additional amounts. Is that
The terrestrial cycle could saturate for sure, but the ocean, it's just diffusion, right? It's going to diffuse in here. It could slow down if we do things like if the thermohaline circulation, the amount of deep water formation changes. This number could drastically decrease, but it'll never saturate completely because it's got to just diffuse in there, and it will, basically.
The increase in acidity of the ocean water because of continuous carbonic acid formation.
Right,
Is that
right.
going to help with how to saturate? Because I mean,
It will never saturate, right? So right, when you add CO2 to water, it basically this equation ensues. So the buffering capacity of the ocean is able to suck in this CO2 into bicarbonate, right? But when you do this, you produce hydronium ions and drop the pH. And so the decrease in the pH of the oceans is no surprise, right? You can model that with undergraduate chemistry. And folks were saying it in the 80s, pH is going to change. It's suddenly become on the radar screen because it's a measurable number. It's decreased 0.1 units. But it's no surprise. And again, it will continue to drop as long as the oceans take up CO2.
So just by like the Chatelier's principle, won't this saturate like within some finite number of years?
The problem is that the pool is so huge that it's not going to saturate with respect to the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the ocean, into the atmosphere, sorry.
Is there a possible problem that if the pH drops by a certain amount, it would be damaging to the living organisms in the ocean?
Sure, yeah, it could, because like we saw, right, the shells of those organisms, right, are made up of calcium carbonate, right? You add a hydronium ion, decrease the pH, you start dissolving their shells, and so that's pretty damaging. But all this has not worked out. I mean, we have no clue which way it's going to go. You know, we don't know what a 0.3 unit pH drop is going to do in the grand scheme. So it's a concern, and it's going to play out, but we don't know what the endpoint is going to look like. Coral's also made up of this, right? And this is why. So what is a gigaton? I'm not going to be able to do a great job. I couldn't really think of a good way to sort of drive this home. That's a gigaton, right? If you want to see a lot of zeros, there's a lot of zeros. Remember, a ton is 2,200 pounds. If you start thinking about it in terms of trees, I'm from the School of Forestry, so we do this a little bit, right? And you know, a single tree has a few hundred to a few thousand kilograms of carbon. Trees are about 50% carbon. An acre of trees holds a few hundred tons of carbon. One way to maybe think about it is there are 650 gigatons of carbon in trees right now over the whole Earth, right? So in the next 10 years, the amount of fossil fuels we're going to put in the atmosphere is like cutting down 10% of all the trees in the Earth and burning them. Or in the next 80 years or so, cutting down all the trees on Earth and burning them. So this is why I think the scale is critical to try to get your arms around, right? When we're talking about decreasing a gigaton of CO2 emissions or 5 gigatons, this is a very big number, and the engineering involved is going to be amazing, and it'll be very cool to hopefully see this play out. However, when we're starting to think about our portfolio as a country or as a region or the globe, what are we going to do to decrease this CO2? Managing the natural carbon cycle is now on the table, right? How are we going to increase the amount of trees on land? How are we going to decrease deforestation? And it's on the table, and I think it will continue to be on the table simply due to this scale. We have to try to do everything at once, basically. And one of them is going to be managing the natural carbon cycle. Yeah. When you start to think about personally, right, maybe it starts to come home like, I emitted a ton coming here, a ton of CO2 on my airfare out here. Driving my car around, I probably emit 1 or 2 tons a year. So it scales up very quickly. So hopefully, the carbon cycle is big, right? And the natural carbon cycle is on our side, and it can deal with a certain amount of CO2 that we add. To manage this, it's going to be a colossal effort, and I got a couple nice slides at the end that talk about that. And part of it, I think, is going to include tinkering with the natural carbon budget, but should it, right? What do we know about the natural carbon cycle with respect to trying to manage it? I'll talk about 2, right? The first is forests. There are 4 ways you can use forests to increase or decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? The first is regrowth. We've cut down huge amounts of forests. I'll talk about this a little bit. The second one is to increase the amount of carbon in a given acre of forest. We're doing this, we can do this, there are ways to do this. You can expand the use of forest products to replace fossil fuels, right? Because trees are taking their CO2 up every year. If we burn them, we're just adding it back, and it's cyclical. It's not taking it out of long-term storage like fossil fuels. It's not a one-way street, right? It's a cyclical. So if we can think of ways to use forest products, right, this would include maybe stuff like ethanol production in grasslands. To replace fossil fuels, this is one way. And another one that seems like a no-brainer, right, is to reduce deforestation. Deforestation is somewhere between 1 or 2 billion tons of CO2 go in the atmosphere a year. If we can stop this from happening, this seems like a good way to go. And you know, here's a nice photograph of Massachusetts in the late 1880s, and then in 1980, right? This is the same hill right here. And you can get an idea of the amount of forest, the amount of carbon that's being sequestered over time in here, right? You're going from bare grassland or grassland to trees. Trees hold a lot more carbon than grassland. And so it's thought that, you know, in the last couple hundred years, we released about 200 gigatons of carbon over time by doing this through clear cutting everywhere, right? And so there's the potential to take that back up if we let these areas go back to forest.
So the way that I understand this, though, is that after a certain point, you know, after 100 years or so, the rate at which these forests are regrowing slows down quite a bit. And in New England in particular, a lot of that reforestation is at that place on the curve where they're going to slow down in terms of their growth. So in terms of reforestation, like to what extent can certain areas actually functionally take up a lot of carbon?
Well, yeah, like you said, this area is still growing, right? This is actually one of the areas where we're measuring this at this Harvard forest is an area where we're measuring this at as precisely as we can. It's still taking up carbon, but you're right, it does slow. And this is why, you know, pre-anthropogenic, it was a steady state between primary production and respiration. Once you get a mature forest, it's at equilibrium more or less, except for responding to like lightning strike and stuff. So right, this only takes up carbon for a couple hundred years, and then it stops. But it does take up carbon, right? In the next 100-year window, people are seeing as a critical time to try to take up as much CO2 as we can, because we see a lag time in the engineering that we need to get off of fossil fuels. So we'd still like to see this happen. Question I have is, you know, when you start talking about carbon credits, should Massachusetts get credit for regrowing what they cut down 200 years ago, right? We added it to the atmosphere 200 years ago. Should we be given credit for just letting it go back, right? We're getting paid twice, sort of. And then, you know, you can get an idea with like the U.S. So this is all the agriculture in red, right? You'll see the agriculture will move away from the northeast, right, pretty early in time. So all this area is regrowing. And then after 1950s, you'll see a big area here, which has been abandoned. This is sort of marginal agricultural land. And so this area is regrowing at a faster rate because it's lower on that curve. Although with ethanol production, some of this land is coming back into production. So there's huge amounts of carbon that could potentially be taken up through reforestation.
I have another question.
Sure.
Also, you know, the way that I understand this works is that it's not just CO2 that we need to worry about when we're trying to take up carbon and biomass. It's also all these other things that limit primary productivity. So, you know, soil nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, calcium. And so how are people proposing to deal with that? You know, because you can have all the CO2 in the world, but if there's not enough nitrogen in the soil, plants aren't going to be able to grow any faster.
Right. Yeah. So there's a big unknown in the final capacity because, like you say, there could be something else that comes in and limits these trees to grow. Most places in the globe currently, and particularly this area, has plenty of nitrogen due to other anthropogenic disturbances. But trying to model on a global scale how a specific region can respond is difficult because other things can come in and limit. But yeah, it's just one of the unknowns. And that's sort of what I'm going to start to building to is there's a lot of unknowns, right? When we're just thinking about managing the carbon cycle, there's a ton of unknowns. The science has only been going on in earnest for 10 or 15 years, so we don't know much. You can obtain, you can increase density on the ground of a forest. One way that this occurred was fire suppression, even though this is not what they were trying to do when they were trying to suppress fires. They were not trying to sequester carbon, but there's a lot of people that are arguing that that forests have sequestered CO2 over time due to this man-made management decision, right? And here's a slide that I got that sort of portrays this. There's some caveats involved, but we won't get into it. The point just being that you can take your forests from what they were in the early 1900s, manage them differently, and the forest can change dramatically. And you can easily see that this forest here, right, is holding more above ground biomass than that forest there. At least lots of people have argued that. And they've scaled it up to a number that makes the U.S.'s carbon budget ledger, right? We want to understand how this has happened. Of course, an unintended consequence is it seems like fire rates are increasing and we're just re-releasing this stored stuff back to the atmosphere. So there's a big question about how safe carbon is when we manage the natural carbon cycle. What sort of horizon are we looking at? How long can we surely say that this stuff is going to be stored, particularly on land? This is a very real question that hasn't been worked out.
There may not be an answer to this, but in terms of scale, like if we took all available land and planted it intensely, can you soak up what we currently put out? I mean, I'm trying to get my head around sort of the imbalance here.
Definitely not all of it.
So what we have already released exceeds our current capacity right now.
That's a good question. I mean, if we took our grasslands, if we started to do afforestation, right, which is taking land that was never a forest and making it a forest, maybe we could start to reach there. But if you talk about reforestation, there's not enough land to pull us out of the problem. But there's enough to pull out, tens of gigatons.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the idea in terms of like sort of this mass transfer from the fossil fuels
right.
that were sequestered that we've now released.
Yeah. It's important enough to think about, but it couldn't be even if in some dream world it couldn't be the only way to move forward. And there are other things that come into play, which I'll talk a little bit about.
Just for the sake of somewhat insane devil's advocacy to build on that, if one was to say that you want to have a young growing forest because that's what's going to be taking as much carbon right off the bat, and somebody said, well then, let's cut down all the existing forests, mill the wood so we don't burn it, so the carbon is still sequestered, and then replant everything right from the get-go, wouldn't that be a wonderful way to be pulling all the carbon out of the atmosphere?
Yeah, and there are people who try to think about the whole lifestyle, right? If you cut down a forest and use it for heating, or as opposed to making furniture, there are people who think about how long is that furniture, what's the life cycle of a furniture, a desk or something, and so people are now starting to think about that. But there are also other questions, which I'm going to get to a little more, like if you cut down a forest, how do you change the reflective balance of land? How much of the solar energy is now being caught that wasn't? How are you affecting the water budget, which is also a greenhouse gas? So there are layers upon layers upon layers.
I just wanted to comment on the fire suppression policy. I think it has been reversed on the ecological grounds because this changes the ecosystem and some invasive species come in. So probably we should also think about not only about the just balance of carbon and the map, but also about other ecological consequences.
Sure. Yeah, and like I said, it was not instated to sequester CO2. It's just something that happened. It's an example of something that's increased the density of forest to suck up CO2, and there are other ideas on how to make this occur.
Just a quick point. I mean, most of you are probably thinking about our hike the other day in management practices, so you kind of see it going in that direction.
I think one of the things that concerns me about this sort of idea of reforestation for carbon sequestration is that it devalues ecosystem doing this and sort of just completely disregarding ecology of all these natural ecosystems.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you're doing this for a global ecological problem, but you create new ecological problems, and it's ecology against ecology, and there's no good answer.
I think it's also important to point out that not all grasslands are, I mean, there are certain types of grasslands that very well may be very good at sequestering carbon as well. A lot of wetlands are excellent at it, like peat bogs and stuff like that. So it's not just forests that have these large stocks of carbon in them. It's sort of ones you think about because you see the big trees, but a lot of what you are actually interested in is carbon that's sort of underground, because in some ways even more sequestered down there. I mean, forest fire can burn, but that's because of peat bog, but you know.
Peat's burned too.
Right. But I mean, like, you know, there are other subterranean carbon stocks that are probably a little bit more permanent.
Right, and well, actually, one of the biggest concerns about soil carbon is most of the soil carbon's in the northern latitudes as peat. And the concern is as it warms, it dries, and as it dries, it's more susceptible to burning. And so this stuff that was sequestered, most of it was sequestered after the last glaciation, so 20,000, 18,000 years ago. We might see back in the atmosphere now more quickly.
We also see large methane.
Right. Reduce deforestation, right? Again, this seems like a no-brainer. It seems like, from my point of view, people are starting to quibble about how we go about this, right? Where sort of the UN framework wanted to set a baseline deforestation rate for each country and then give them credits for going above or below that baseline. But some people started to think that perhaps the only people who stand to gain are the people that are currently deforesting. And if other countries are doing a good job of not deforesting now, they stand nothing to gain under this protocol. So there's a new proposal out there from this sort of think tank who want to try to put out a certain amount of global credits for deforestation, right? We can do 500 million tons a year, and then each countries can trade amongst themselves to meet that cap. But people are starting to put their heads together and think about ways to move towards a solution to decrease deforestation. And I have a feeling in Kyoto, this will probably be, when they try to redefine it, will probably be something of a lot of debate. So unintended consequences, and people have already started sort of touching upon this, right? And the main one here is the carbon balance is only one side of the coin, right? It's arguably the biggest side of the coin. CO2 is the largest greenhouse gas. But we can both change the radiative budget in other ways. We can also, when we start tinkering with an ecosystem, there are unintended consequences that can affect other things that we try to manage ecosystems for, right? And this is one example. The largest change with respect to rising temperature is in the Arctic. And so lots of areas of the Arctic look like this, right? And as it warms, it's thought to move to this. And the first thinking on this was, this is a good thing, right? You can see with your bare eye again that this ecosystem is storing more carbon than this one. The problem is that when you're covered with snow, right? The snow is over the vegetation here, and it's reflecting lots of sunlight back into space. And this is one of the best ways to decrease global warming, is to shoot it right back into space before it even enters the greenhouse budget, sort of. Snow here goes below the vegetation, and this vegetation starts absorbing more heat than it did previously. And this is one of the biggest concerns, and one of these positive feedbacks is as the Arctic moves from this to this, it's actually going to absorb more heat, store a little more carbon, but absorb more heat. And so we're now trying to sort of get a handle on this, right? And when you change an ecosystem to manage carbon, how are you changing the complete radiative budget, not just carbon? And water flux to the atmosphere is another one that people are now starting to think about. But the science is still young enough where in most ecosystems we don't know how the radiative budget changes as we tweak the carbon cycle. Another unintended consequence, this is with water, right? This is just a schematic to remind us that plants are big movers of waters, right? They take water from soil and they move it into the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, it's a greenhouse gas. Well, it absorbs heat, but also, right, water is a commodity, and water is something that in some areas of the globe is scarce. And here's a kind of an interesting recent study where they were looking at plantations. And plantations are one of the big ways that we're thinking about moving forward to store carbon. Right? Let's plant plantations, harvest it at regular intervals, use that wood for fuel and for other purposes to sequester carbon. Unfortunately, particularly when a plantation is just starting to grow, it's very thirsty for water. And it pulls a lot of water out of the soils and moves it into the atmosphere, leaving less for streams and rivers, leaving less for people who depend upon that water as their water source. So this is a big unintended consequence. As we try to manage something for carbon, how is it going to affect water, particularly in areas where water is scarce? Water rights, it seems like it's rising to be one of the main issues with global change. And then, of course, you know, right now a ton of carbon is trading at about $10. And so if it moves up to 50, it's conceivable that people are going to start to actually try to make money with this, and people already are. And one thing that folks might start to do is take land out of food production for carbon production, right? And this is occurring with ethanol right now. And it has a chance to change global food markets in ways that are perhaps negative. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time, I don't know how I'm doing for time here, it's been fine, to talk about ocean sequestration. And we won't get into the as detailed here, but there's also movement afoot to manage the ocean carbon cycle. And it's mostly through trying to increase what folks call the biological pump. And it's a pump that pumps CO2 out of the atmosphere into deep water. And the way it works is, you know, CO2 is taken up by phytoplankton, and they move up the food chain, or they form these globs that become heavy enough to sink. And this stuff rains down. It's actually called marine snow, right? It snows down into the deep ocean, and you've taken the CO2 out of the surface water, and you've moved it to the deep ocean where we won't see it for 500 years, right? And so the question becomes are there ways we can engineer and tweak this so that this becomes a larger flux? And it turns out there are. It's pretty intriguing. This is just a global view of levels of chlorophyll, which is a sort of an index of where primary production occurs in the ocean. The greener areas are where primary production is higher, right? And many of you have probably already been taught about this, but there are vast areas of the ocean that don't have high levels of primary production, yet they seem to have plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus, which is what limits primary production in most of the ocean. And there was a guy named John Martin. He sort of joked in the early 1990s. He says, give me a half a shipload of iron and I'll give you the next ice age. Right? And what he meant by that was he was hypothesizing that these vast areas of the ocean their primary production was limited because they didn't have enough iron. And it's just because they're so far away from any land mass, and dust is what brings iron into the ocean, that they don't get enough dust input and primary production is limited. There's plenty of all the other things you need for primary production. If you could just put iron in there, you'd see blooms. And you'd suck down CO2. If you pull CO2 out, it gets cold, we go into an ice age. That was sort of his reasoning. And this has been confirmed over the past couple decades. These areas are limited by iron, and John Martin was right. And the question becomes, can we increase production by dumping iron out there, and can we move this CO2 out of the surface ocean? The interesting part is just a little bit of iron can lead to a huge increase in primary production. So it's something that's feasible. You can imagine ships going out there and dumping iron into there, and you will see a huge response from primary production, right? And this can scale up. You can take enough iron out there that you know, depending on how you do your math, you could conceivably start sequestering gigatons, billions of tons, right? And so, you know, you just take a ship out there and you dump iron and you see a response from your single cell primer producers. It becomes green. When we've done these experiments, you can see this from space. You can see this green patch, this response from space, just from, you know, one scientific experiment. The question becomes not can we produce this green patch, because we know we can, but how much of this green patch sinks, right? Because we saw in the global cycle that it's, you know, we know at least 80% of it probably gets recycled right back in surface waters. How much of this green patch sinks to the deeper ocean is the unknown question currently. I think there's been about 5 or 6 of these experiments, and some of them have seen sinking, some of them have not. One of the problems is none of them have been out there long enough to really look at this patch for a long period of time.
A few of us were actually talking about this the other day, and one thing that came up that I've wondered before is who controls this? Like, we're talking about the open ocean, and like, what international body regulates this? Like, if you're on, you know, if you're dealing with ocean water that's right next to a nation, like, that nation controls what happens in that water. But in the open ocean, like, does anybody control that? And what if certain countries who are trying to deal with climate change don't want this to happen? Like, how does that get worked out? Do you have any idea?
I think right now, as the lawyers have said, that there's nothing strong on the books that seems to concretely say that you can't do this. However, it's so young that, you know, this hasn't been worked out. But it's not being done at a large scale yet. But if it was, I would imagine that the lawyers would get involved.
Would there have to be some major international agreement for this to happen?
Well, you know, there are international agreements on certain things for ocean dumping. And the question was, you know, did iron fall at that? And I think it's unclear enough that there's an opening, in my understanding. Maybe someone knows more.
This is a really big problem with geoengineering in general. I mean, you can shoot sulfur particles into the atmosphere pretty cheaply, and so they're just worried that, you know, some billionaire who wants to solve climate change just goes and gets some artillery shells and just starts lobbing these things willy-nilly. So I think it really is an issue that needs to be dealt with, probably by policymakers, ethicists, in general.
Just real quick, is this a temporary effect, or do you establish an ecosystem?
Well, this patch will, you know, yeah, you'll put it in there, it'll bloom, and then it'll die off. So, you know, a single patch from a ship is pretty temporary, but if we were to start doing this in a huge amount, we would start to change the ecosystem in ways that we don't know, because we haven't conducted experiments over any period of time.
How are you observing whether how the algae is actually being taken up? As in, is it like some kind of iron labeling?
What you do is you put in tracers with your water patch, and you can see how the growth changes inside and outside your patch. That's one way. And then you can view it from space. You can see it develop once you start putting it in. But
how do you see whether it goes, how it is taken up into the...
How do you see if it sinks? These are done with sediment traps. And this is actually an art form that isn't really that worked out. And they're sort of getting at this, because what has happened, my understanding is, right, you'll have the surface ocean here, and you'll create this patch. And to date, you know, these traps are, you know, they're at 3,000, 4,000 meters, you know, maybe a couple up here, and they're just cups, right, that are collecting this stuff as it rains down. The problem, because, you know, the water is moving in all different directions, and you could have this stuff sinking over here, where you don't have any traps. And so this becomes a real sort of art form of them trying to figure out if this stuff is sinking or not.
I think it's also important to point out that regardless of whether, we don't know if this works, but there is a company called Planktos that currently has a ship circulating the globe, fertilizing oceans, and you can buy carbon credits from that.
Didn't that fail?
Yeah, that was my next slide, right? Planktos was shut down.
Oh, it was, okay.
Yeah, you can actually go on YouTube and see some nice videos about. It's actually interesting to go see Planktos video on how they think this works, because it is sort of grounded in some pretty good science, and you know they're not the evil empire, right? They're doing what they thought was good. So there were 2 companies on the books that were raising money to do this, right? One of these is a Silicon Valley sort of startup. Planktos had a ship out there in November that was sort of circling the Galapagos wanting to do this. But they were basically shut down, and they were shut down from an uproar from environmental groups. So here's a company that's trying to sequester CO2, right? It's based on some science, right? The science is young, undoubtedly. They're trying to go out there and do this, and they're shut down on environmental concerns. It's sort of an interesting sort of idea, right? Someone who's trying to help the planet shut down because they're going to hurt the planet. Both of the arguments based on some pretty loose science. Regardless, countries are moving forward with more experiments, which is great. You know, I would have actually loved to see Planktos dump it, because they were going to do some monitoring. They were going to study this to some degree. Maybe they shouldn't be selling credits yet, but you know, regardless, they were going to start doing this and give us some more information. So this is taking a huge hit because of Planktos, right? No investors aren't going to touch this with a big pole for a while. So this is going to occur much slowly now because of environmental concerns.
So when you're talking about CO2 sequestration, what you're essentially doing is you're actually sequestering energy, because light is being converted into carbohydrate, and that's what basically burns up to give you the energy that you need for work. So isn't it kind of a form of energy sequestration, which is there like a limit that people have worked out that the Earth has for energy sequestration? Because I mean, if you're having more energy, there's more potential of, like the forest fire being a very good example.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how far that's been taken, but that's an interesting line of reasoning. Yeah, I don't know. Should we take a break? I mean, I got probably like 10 more minutes of slides.
Why don't you do that, and then we'll take a break.
Okay. So, you know, the point here again is the science is young. And the science in all this is young. And there are unintended consequences here. Production of other greenhouse gases, which algae do. Impact on higher trophic levels. This much more than on land, it's very hard to measure. So if you're thinking about moving towards credits, the expense of measuring this right now would probably take away all the potential money that investors could make. So I just wanted to come back at the end here to drive home again this idea of scale. And these folks at Princeton, I think, have done a very good job of driving this home. They've come up with this wedge idea. And there are 15 wedges that they've done. They're all back of the envelope calculations. And in order to get to 50%, I think, of 1990 levels, we had to meet 7 of these wedges. And we can pick any of the 15 that we want, right? And so I think this gives you a decent idea of the scale of the problem, right? So we have to hit 7 of the 15. There's another set after this, right? So decrease the number of car miles traveled by the world by half, right? Increase wind electricity capacity by 50 times, so more or less put up 2 million windmills. So each one of these on this own, it seems very big but doable when you read it. But when you start to try to add up 7, I think it starts to come across of what a colossal effort this is really going to be, right? And within this, they include 2 natural sinks. I'm not sure the reasoning for picking just these 2, right? But one of these wedges could be completely eliminate deforestation and double the current rate of new forest planting, right? That's one wedge. And so that's the idea of the scale. And so in my mind, I think one of the, and then of course, you know, we're not spending any more money on the science, unfortunately. So this is the military spending, this is the science spending, and the science spending is going to have to start to look like this, or maybe at least this, to begin to understand this completely. But that's not happening. So, you know, I think what's starting to play out when you start to talk about should we manage the natural carbon sinks, there's something like the scale, the importance of this problem, how many billion tons we have to sequester. We have to start to try to do everything we can. We should be exploring iron fertilization more. We don't know if it's going to work yet, but we shouldn't boot it just because of some initial environmental concerns. We should be exploring this because we need everything if we're going to get serious about this. Unfortunately, right now, the uncertainty in these natural sinks is so huge that it's difficult to imagine giving credit for this because we don't know if you should be. You certainly should be giving credit for putting up windmills. This is clear, right? But should you be given credit for growing your forest with all the problems and sort of the lack of clear guidance from the science? And I sort of think that this is going to go forward to some degree. There's no reason to think right now, sort of looking, that this isn't. And so we have to try to collect our data as fast as we can, but we also have to bring everyone together to try to figure out how to move forward safely and equitably and fairly. So, that's it. So are there any questions?
So you talked about all these uncertainties, and as a scientist, what do you think some of the biggest, what would help the policymakers most? What are the maybe most important questions from your perspective?
The biggest questions are looking at the whole radiative budget instead of just carbon, right? And some people are doing some really interesting stuff now, trying to, in particular, think about water, and both water and the reflective capacity of the vegetation before and after. So I think that's the science and even the technology to make those measurements are new, and that's one of the big areas, to look at the complete radiative budget instead of looking at just carbon.
I've heard that there's a movement in some corners toward bioengineering plants and fungi that are like mega CO2 engines. They'll just take up tons of CO2, like more than any other normal plants would. Do you know anything about that, and what's your opinion on that?
I don't know much about that, but usually what the problem is people come up with these great sort of benchtop ideas, but then they can't scale up. And I could imagine with this scenario, if you're trying to grow fungus and bacteria, the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus you would need to sequester a billion tons would be out of the range of you would spend more money fertilizing these things than you would to capture carbon. So most of the ideas, and that's the big trouble. There are lots of good ideas out there, but most of the good ideas don't scale up, so they're not great ideas.
So that brings up, the scale problem brings up a comment that I heard in the ladies' room, which is, I hate talking about climate change because it's too big and too terrible, and there's nothing we can do. So what do you think the scientific community should do in terms of balancing, communicating the scope of the problem appropriately, but not so much that people are like, well, forget it, it's hopeless? Well,
I think the Princeton job has done a great job of that with those 15 wedges, because if you read each one, a dozen of them are doable, and you can say, hey, we can do this, and we can do this. We can get our arms around this, and I'd like to think we will, and I think it'll be a great time to be a scientist, to try to make some of these measurements and figure out if we're doing it and how to do it. But the bigger take-home message is to try to get the public to understand the scale, and that it's both personal, it's going to affect everyone's pocketbook, and that the scale is big. And so we got to get the public behind, and the political will behind, to understand how large we have to move. It's not to say it's not impossible, and I like to think it's not even improbable, but we have to start to convey this idea of the scale so that people understand that this is a massive project. And we also have to, I think, be careful, when all these other things that ecosystems do, we have to give a little leeway here. If we really want to do this, we have to give a little leeway to folks to start exploring. this is the worst time to shut people down based on other concerns. Planktos wasn't going to change the nature of the oceans because they were just going to put a couple tankers out there. But, we don't want to shut down ideas now. We want to sort of encourage them, but we have to do it in a proper framework.
What is your take on carbon credits? I know you mentioned them a couple times. Do you think they're a very useful way to help reduce carbon emissions, or are they just ways people are already kind of like feeling better about what they're doing?
Well, they certainly seem to work. Like you say, I was given the task from my school to offset all our travel. And so, our school we're gonna hand someone a check for 20 grand a year and say, offset our carbon. And then the tricky part comes in, what kind of projects do you want to see people do to offset that carbon? I think it's a great thing. I mean, our school obviously has the money to do this. This traveling, it's not gonna stop, it's mostly educational. It would be great if lots of people did it. Obviously, it can't scale up either, but it sends a good message. And but then when I was asked where we should spend this money, I said I don't want to spend it anywhere. I want us to use it. I want us to start projects, and I want this to be educational, so we can start to because the real money right now needs to be spent on coming up with the new ideas, because you never know what the consequences are of the money that you hand over to someone else at this point. It's still so young that there's no carbon police out there. There's gonna be, but they're not there now.
So you mentioned travel, and I think this is probably being talked about in university communities all over the U.S. Faculty travel all the time. We go to conferences. Graduate students travel a lot, and you said that that's not going to change. But I'm wondering, do you think that sort of thinking, can we really apply that here? I mean, are we still going to be traveling as much as we do now, 10, 15 years from now?
Hopefully less. I mean, in some of the working groups and stuff I'm on, they've really tried to move towards, at least half of their meetings be over the phone. But personally, those meetings are much less productive. So right now, still, to get this stuff done to some degree, at least with what I do, it pays to travel and maybe pay someone else to offset your carbon.
I think that's a great point, which is just that until it costs more financially, we're not really going to modify our behaviors. Whether it costs more by paying somebody else to offset it, or it costs more because there's some sort of government regulation, a carbon tax, or a cap and trade system, until it actually hits us in the pocketbook and in the resources we have at our disposal, our behaviors aren't going to modify on me. So, in 15 years, if there's a carbon tax, I bet we'll be traveling a lot less.
Right. So if the carbon tax was in now, I would have had to pay $30
right.
to come here. And maybe that wouldn't have affected me coming here, but maybe it would have affected me taking my whole family.
So, $30 extra would probably keep me home from one extra trip that east per year, but probably still be here. But it does, within the margin, it does modify behavior. A lot more than just saying we should all do it because we're nice people.
I've seen a report that Norway is pumping CO2 into the void where they pump out the oil out of the North Sea. Is that an option, or is that going to make any impact? Or
yeah, that's definitely moving forward. It's something I don't study, but it definitely can scale up. Some of the main unknowns now are sort of the how leaky these storage things really are. We don't really know. If you pump it down in Texas, you could be pumping it and it could be pouring out your neighbor's yard or some other old drill hole that's there. So it's definitely going to move forward, and the question becomes, how safe is it, and can we really monitor if you're putting it down in one place, how long it's staying there again?
I have a question about the iron fertilization. What are some of the potential consequences? Do they have any idea? I don't know anything about ocean ecosystems, but when I first heard about that, it sounded really bad to me. Like, I read it and I thought this is a really bad idea because it just seemed like something that we were messing with that we didn't know what the outcome would be. But I don't know. I'm just curious what your opinion is in terms
Yeah,
of
we don't-
safety and.
We don't know what the outcome is. Probably one of the first things that we should figure out is how much sinks, right? That's one of the big issues. Another issue that's a little bit harder to sort of get your arms around is folks are now starting to think of if you fertilize an area of the ocean with iron, phytoplankton take up nitrogen and phosphorus, right? They still take it up, and then that stuff sinks out. The question becomes is would that nitrogen and phosphorus been used downstream? And are we now taking primary production away down here simply to add it here? That's a pretty big question that needs to be worked out. So how much sinks? Are we sort of stealing from here to get primary production here? And then the production of these other gases, because some of these species of phytoplankton do this fairly well, stuff like nitrous oxide. And a little bit of these more potent greenhouse gases can completely erase anything. So, my feeling right now is it should be explored more. We shouldn't be shutting it down. Perhaps we shouldn't be giving carbon credits for it yet. I think that's what really got people angry. But then again, that's a way to get other people to pay for this exploration, right? We're not getting the money from the government we need. I'd love it if Silicon Valley was funding ocean fertilization just from the experimental point of view, because they are going to be doing some monitoring. We are going to learn. We're going to be giving people credits for a little while for something that may turn out to be not a credit. But I don't know. I would like to see more of it done.
Actually, do you think it would be ethical to give carbon credits for climate research?
I don't know. That's a good point. I'll take it. But we do need more research, right? And probably some degree of the carbon credits we're spending right now are not truly going to be credits. A certain percentage of them for sure are not going to work out because we're moving too fast.
So you mentioned that the governmental funding for these problems is inadequate, and I wonder what is the stance of industry in research and development? Are they following? Are they lagging behind, or are they taking some steps even ahead?
I don't know a lot about this, but industry seems to be embracing it to some degree, right? The students that we're training in our Masters of Environmental Management are having no trouble finding jobs because every company's trying to get green to some degree. Whether they're doing that, to a degree that they should is a big open question. But people are moving fast to become green, both from just sort of an image point of view, but also because there's some feeling now that there's going to be money to be made here. Certainly Ford, made a very bad decision not to become greener sooner, and they're paying for it. And this is opening other companies' eyes that this is a part of the equation. And so they're definitely starting to move.
What do you make of the Hadley coupled model predicted if you have too rapid of a temperature change, you have massive dieback on the forest dieback. You didn't discuss in your presentation the potential to re-release all that carbon you relied upon if temperature increases go up, which would in fact exacerbate the problem, particularly if you relied upon forests as an alternative to other ways of reducing greenhouse gases. What is your sense of all of that?
I'm actually not a huge fan of forest credits for exactly these types of reasons. They seem very ephemeral to me. Maybe growing forests to replace fossil fuels makes a little more sense because that seems like something you can hold in your hand. The models are all they're difficult to distill because they seem to have a lot of errors associated with them already. In my department, we have a lot of social scientists, and something I hear them say all the time is, We don't need to spend any more time for another model, you know, and it's actually the exact opposite. You know, to think that we can have 10 models out there that are going to predict how the globe is going to respond is very naive, and it's actually a resource that we should be investing a lot more in. Modelers, for some reason, you know, they're not embraced as much as they should, and we should have a lot more of them trying to figure out, you know, how places are really going to respond, because, you know, the state of the models right now is you can't predict how Montana's climate's going to change. You can take all these models and average them, but that's actually fairly meaningless because the models are going in all different directions. So, and that's the level we need to be at. We need to know to be able to determine what Montana should be doing, to try to think about, you know, how it should prepare for climate change. They need good models, and those aren't out there. I don't know if that answers your question.
I was wondering what you thought about the potential for rapid global forest dieback if you have increases in temperature, and if you have that kind of phenomenon, that really undermines the ability of forests to have permanent storage of carbon. Do you think that's a real concern?
I think it's a huge concern, and you can tick off 5 different reasons. You know, increased insect outbreaks. You know, pests moving to places where they couldn't survive before. That's happening in the Northeast. So I don't think we can seriously manage the forest carbon cycle in any way that with any certainty. It's much more difficult, I think, to think of than the oceans, where at least you know if you move carbon to the deep ocean, you're not going to see it again for a few hundred years. In the forests, you know, you could certainly not see it again for another decade, but it's very tricky.
Going on the same model sort of question, there are sort of 2 major issues in that. There's the data collection and the data processing. I know there's a sort of big debate in the modeling community about which one's a bigger issue. So you have proposals like create the largest data computer system dedicated entirely to climate modeling, except that would cost billions and billions of dollars that you could use to actually collect the data that you would need to put into these things. Do you have any sense of what the bigger weakness is, the processing or the data input?
I wouldn't. I mean, I'd be just guessing. I mean, it's the data collection is fairly sad. I mean, one of the saddest things in the science right now is you know, the direction NASA has taken in the past few years, where the Earth observing satellites are going. I mean, we're not going to be able to produce those maps of ocean primary production in a couple of years because we're not going to have a satellite to do it. And to think about that, I think we'd rather spend our money to go to Mars than to be able to, you know, sense what the Earth is doing. In my mind, is really sad. It's one of the more sadder state of the science right now is our lack of the ability to sense what the Earth is doing, when in fact it's not expensive, massively expensive stuff. You know, these satellites are a great tool. And to think we don't have one that's going to be able to do ocean color in a couple of years is pretty amazing.
Yeah, on that same note, in terms of processing, we already have, I think, 3 or 4 of the largest computers in the world completely dedicated to climate research.
But still, it's not quite enough.
Well, but for processing, I mean, you know, that's sort of there's these classic graphs of how fast processor speeds grow with time, and it doubles every 8 months or something. And I mean, that's coming, but in terms of data collection, there is a really big problem, especially I think as regards to the ocean, because we don't have ways of sampling ocean currents, especially the deep ocean currents that are responsible for a lot of this transport into deep ocean reservoirs. I mean, our sampling rate in the deep ocean would be equivalent to having like 3 weather stations in all of the United States, or something along those lines. And so, you know, we don't have the technology to do it, we don't have the resources to do it, and that leaves really big question marks in a lot of our budgets.
I was just going to say, I think in modeling, some of the steps that where it's going is doing a better job of modeling these couplings between dynamical systems. You know, there's these papers that came out last year that said for temperature, you know, people want a really good, you know, how much is the temperature going to go up if the concentration of CO2 goes up? And there's this argument that just inherent in models is this: there's going to be some uncertainty inherent inherent in predicting climate sensitivity, which is what the term they associate with the temperature rise per CO2 or whatever. And so I think to look for a perfect model that's going to tell you exactly what the temperature is going to be is not the direction we're going. More doing a better job of modeling the interactions between these systems, like forests, so on and so forth.
But the more interactions you're going to take into account, that's extremely processor intensive. So the more dynamic you're going to make a model, the more it's going to cost you as far as the processing power. And there's only so much to go around. Even these distributed projects, they don't work.
I don't know really all that many people in the field who aren't getting computer time they need. I mean, obviously we want more, and we always want more, but I don't think that's not the big issue right now. The bigger issue, I think, is
The assumptions.
The assumptions.
Right, yeah. Build a good model.
Right. I mean, we have tons of computer time, and we're especially with the next round of IPC coming, and those grant proposals is coming back right now. I mean, I think we feel satisfied with where we are and where we're going in terms of processor time. Everything else is unsatisfactory.
Yesterday we had a talk where we were told about ethical dilemmas that exist in the third dimension, and what Rosenberg meant by that was dilemmas that really kind of cut to the core of what it means to be a human and essentially a human on this planet. And what you're talking about here with tweaking the carbon cycle is definitely a dilemma that exists in the third dimension. And when you started, maybe it's because you're from Yale or something, I felt really good about what you were saying. You got some great diagrams there. The one with the boxes I just thought was awesome. But as we got towards the end of the talk, I started to get the kinds of worries that you brought up, which are perhaps the environmental community's worries, which are don't mess with the system any more than we've already messed with it. And so the question is, how do you have to confront these people, the people that shut down the Planktos operation, you have to deal with them. So how do you deal with them? What's the best strategy for a scientist who does what you do to deal with folks that find this very frightening?
Yeah, well, it is frightening to some degree, and it's, a lot of my colleagues who study ocean, who are doing these iron enrichment experiments are massively concerned about how fast people are trying to move with this. But then again, my point of view and my argument would be that we have to let this develop more. If we're too outspoken against it at the beginning and we shut it down, we might have shut down a wedge, right? And we want to keep all the wedges open right now. And in 15 years, hopefully, we'll have a better idea of which of these wedges are actually working. But we don't want to shut down wedges on environmental concerns yet, simply because the science is so new that we can't. The science is far enough along to say that we need wedges, and we need wedges fast.
But the environmentalist response is the science is so new that you don't know what you're doing.
Sure, but the impact on the environment from global warming is also a massive environmental concern, and I think right now that impact should trump the regional impacts. However, we do have to figure out a way to move slowly and ethically, as we try to develop our portfolio. But we don't want to shut down things based on environmental concerns that aren't understood. The classic, one of the classic slides you always see about the unintended consequences of iron fertilization is you see one slide on the left, it's a nice healthy ocean, there's whales, and then on the right you see jellyfish, right? And it's like, that's gonna, people that just starts churning people's mind. They're like, oh my God. And we have no idea, So I would encourage research, and carbon credits, maybe that's not a good idea yet, but then again, like I said, it was going to fund a couple missions out there, and these missions were not going to have drastic impacts. A 3 kilometer square bloom in the ocean is nothing. gone in a month.
I mean, this is not different than the other two topics in our session because you have, it's for society and ethicists in concert with scientists to decide what's acceptable intervention. It's not really a scientific question. Like, is it okay to change the ocean carbon cycle? It's not a scientific question.
To follow up, there's in our discussion over the last couple of days, we talked about the difference between how biotechnology developed with nanotechnology. Biotechnology developed, and I think people got comfortable because it was largely industry funded. And then on nanotechnology, it seems it was government funded. And we don't know where all this is going, but some of I think there was an implication that nanotechnology might be more readily, under this model of largely government. But then going back to a little bit of comment there, for example, this funding of, say, these iron particles, planktos. Now that is a way to stimulate research, is by developing a market and then venture capitalism, but then that might create a lot of suspicion because then there's a vested interest there.
Yeah.
So it's a really kind of, and yet on the other hand, there's sort of a dilemma here. You don't have the government funding. So how do we get the research done? We've got a couple of models, government funding, they're not stepping up to the plate, maybe we should try this, people are uncomfortable with it. So it's kind of like we're in a bad spot.
Yeah, and in the end, a lot of the scientists wouldn't go near, measuring planktos's ability to sequester carbon with a 10-foot pole. I mean, that's just, it could be a career destroyer.
Yeah.
We'd like to see it happen, we just don't want to make the measurements ourselves, kind of thing. And in the end, probably, at some higher level, managing all these natural carbon sinks shouldn't be considered. I mean, it's not, the other wedges are all generally much better ideas.
Right.
But we do want to keep a big portfolio. If these worst case scenario things keep starting to unfold, who knows what position we're going to be in 50 years. So we don't want to just shut them down.
But I think you really raised a really good point. If we have an international cap and trade system, what gets put in?
Yeah, and that's what's being argued right now.
Yeah, because you could, if you put certain things in, you're going to stimulate,
right?
Something over here. And I think
it's looking like reforestation is going in. If I was to put money on it right now, it's going in.
Yeah.
Maybe we can ask the speaker this afternoon what his take, but it looks like it's going in. Deforestation, I think, will go in. It makes sense, but yeah.
Isn't it like a little dangerous at this point to be trying to open the wedges of, this is very new technology, very new research, without actually, so the thing that you keep bringing up, that without knowing the entire consequence of it, because just coming back to what I was saying, that I don't know whether, because we are sequestering more and more carbon, whether we are just, I don't know, so maybe the ocean, after sequestering a lot of the CO2, actually erupts in some kind of, I don't know, some volcanic eruption or something, just because there's so much of energy down there. So there may be more to it than just, so yeah, you can keep sequestering thinking that this is this huge endless tank that can do it, but I really don't know. So to put in research into one wedge instead of getting a whole feel of what this is actually going to affect may just be the concern of most people intrinsically, that yeah, this one thing is doing this effect, but I have absolutely no clue where it's going further.
Right.
So,
some of the better things I've heard, is, with the natural carbon sinks, one thing to just sort of keep in mind is one of the key time frames is the next 50 years, right? What we do in the next 50 years is pretty important. We want to start doing things pretty fast. And so maybe we give ourselves we say, okay, maybe if forest sequestration is 50 years, maybe that's okay because in 50 years, all these other things like the windmills and solar will have kicked in. And we've sort of offset this window of time where emissions would have been really bad, and we get everything else to sort of come up to speed. So perhaps that's one, and that's probably not why the natural sink stuff is going to move forward, but from a scientific point of view, that might be one way where you say this could be a good thing, right? We'll try to do everything we can in the next 50 years while we try to get rid of fossil fuels. And then, you know, we reassess things in 50 years.
And what about, you mentioned it on the side, the ethanol or the, you know, using land space or agriculture ground for ethanol production or other fuel production. Have you seen any impact yet on the deforestation? Increasing it? Or?
Yeah. So there's land that was pulled out of agriculture in the 50s that is now getting pulled back in. You know, one of the things I also study is the chemistry of the Mississippi River. And this year it looks like the largest nitrogen export out the Mississippi on record. And it's because of ethanol, right? And so there's, you know, they're planting all this corn, adding more nitrogen. It's coming down the Mississippi where it impacts the Gulf of Mexico. And I think that to some degree this was one of these experiments that you know, some people are really down on it. Why did we go to all this ethanol? Obviously this and this is going to happen. But now we know some of the things to think about if we were to try this again or try this somewhere else, right? Maybe we want to, you know, think about the world's food market. You know, maybe we want to think about the impacts on the Gulf of Mexico. And so in the end, maybe it turns out to be a bad idea, but it's a learning process. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try things other places. I guess that's, you know, one of my big concerns is we shouldn't not try things because of concerns, because we have to try a huge array of things. And we should have an open mind to some degree about trying things, because if we really believe we have to pull all the CO2 out, we have to.
Well, the ethanol thing is a pretty expensive thing if it, you know, doesn't work out, because everybody put, you know, almost all the eggs in one basket. But also, have you seen anything on a global scale, like, you know, the US uses more ground for growing corn or maybe even wheat now, and so we import more soybean, and so down in Brazil or elsewhere in the world that the deforestation moves ahead because, you know, they have bigger markets for their crops now too, or bigger gains.
I don't know a ton about that, although I would be very surprised if those papers aren't coming out now, because like I said, the data's there, right? We now know probably how the soybean production in Brazil responded. And so we can start to get a handle on how the economic impacts of these types of decisions. And it probably turns out it was a bad idea. It's looking like it. How they went forward with it anyway. But that means hopefully the next time we try it, we'll do it in a better way that's more sustainable.
Just wanted to point out that the amount of land that you have in productive agriculture can affect how much carbon is in the atmosphere, because every time you deforest an area that once had trees and then plow that land, all of the carbon that was in the soil, not just in the above ground biomass, is going to go right into the atmosphere. So it definitely is interconnected.
So one thing that I guess I just want to say really quick about the whole ethanol debate is that I think we're sort of ignoring a huge part of the problem. Maybe, I don't know the numbers exactly, but maybe 25% of the corn crop went to ethanol this year. And like 60% of the corn crop went to animal feed. So should we blame ethanol for the bloom, or should we blame increased meat exportation from the United States? People are just ignoring that.
Yeah, meat is a very inefficient way to feed people in general.
So that basically concludes our morning session. I guess the climate